And let's get into Ned 1. So Ned 1 starts on page 39. Now, this opening page, like we see on the screen, is really the king's party entering Winterfell. Now, we have this idea that there is this really big wheelhouse that has Cersei and kind of the royal family in it, and it can't even get inside the castle wall. Now, we learn this information a little bit later, but I kind of want to paint the picture of what's going on here and why they're meeting outside of Winterfell, like at the gates, instead of how it was in the show, where it was more like it was kind of inside Winterfell. Now, we get a description of the party that's here. We have about 300 knights and the rest of his party, Jaime and his golden hair, Sandor and his burned face, the imp Tyrion Lannister, and this really tall boy, who we learn later on is actually taller than Robb and Jon, Joffrey. So that's some of the named characters we get that instantly are made apparent to us. This is our first time seeing these people. Well, out of all of these characters that Ned kind of recognizes or, infers that these are the people that they are, he really doesn't recognize Robert Baratheon. Robert Baratheon is someone that has gained a significant amount of weight, and he doesn't look anything like how Ned remembers him. Ned, the last time he saw him was during the Greyjoy Rebellion. I believe it was like 9 years ago. And Robert Baratheon has put on a significant amount of weight, and his beard is very unkempt. He looks like someone that has let his life go. And Ned kind of notes this right away. And that will lead us into page 40. So page 40 starts with building on this description like I talked about in page 39, that Robert, when he was younger, it's described very similarly to Drogo, where Robert used to be very clean-shaven. He was 6.5 feet tall, full of muscle. He used to have a warhammer that Ned could barely even lift, really painting the picture of Robert Baratheon being this giant of a man, very similar to the way we get our description of Drogo in the last chapter. Now, to compare where Robert is now, we also have some more information that he has dark circles under his eyes, showing lack of sleep and other ideas of maybe even stress. And we also see that he's covered in perfume to mask his smell. So really everything that could go wrong for Robert, whether that's not keeping yourself right, this or that, it's really apparent here of how much Robert being king has affected him as a person, and Ned notes that. And like I'd said on the last page, we know that Ned has not seen Robert since the Greyjoy Rebellion. We learn here that Theon's father, Balon Greyjoy, had rebelled against the crown. And this is why Theon has become a ward at Winterfell, because of the war his father lost. We haven't really known that till now. We've known up to this point that Theon, he's a ward. We just don't really know why. And we kind of figure that out in this page. And something I think is also very interesting is if we look at Catelyn 1, Ned is very happy to hear that Robert is coming to Winterfell, very different from the way the show kind of does that. We see that Ned actually has to restrain himself. He can't really embrace his friend because he is the king now. And that is something that I think is interesting when we look at the parallels when Jon becomes Lord Commander, where Jon is not able to really be with his friends. He has to be more of the Lord. And that's something that I think Ned passes on to Jon and kind of instills in him, and it's something that comes kind of full circle and dance to this moment. So, like I said, we have this major wheelhouse. It's on screen right now, and it's being pulled by 40 horses. That shows you the weight, how big this thing is. Winterfell is one of the largest castles and grandest castles in all of Westeros, and this major wheelhouse can't even get through the gates. That should really paint a picture of how, one, rich the Lannisters are, how rich really, I guess, the crown is as a whole, and how much different their lives are to the lives of like people living in Winterfell. Like, the North is by no means poor, but they're not having extravaganzas like this to this degree. And we see that Cersei and her younger children are in this wheelhouse, and they are presented. Ned kisses her ring, so we have some kind of formalities just with the children being introduced to each other, with the Stark children and the Lannister children, or the Baratheon children at this point of the story. And we kind of see Robert just kind of being this lighthearted person at this moment. He embraces Catelyn like a sister, and the children meet at this time as well. Now, this is a very interesting idea because we paint this idea that now again in the show travel seems to be varying. At sometimes travel feels very long, other times we have teleporting characters. We learn here that really this party has been traveling for quite a while. And the north is not the most forgiving area. So you would think, everybody would kind of rest and they'd have some sort of feast later on. As soon as Robert gets here, and this kind of holds up the whole party, is that Robert wants to go to the crypts to see Lyanna with Ned. And this is something that I think for Ned is very touching, because for one, there probably at this point, I mean, there's not a lot of people that remember Lyanna for the person that she was. If you think about Ned's father and brother, they're both dead. Benjen's the wall, so he's not really at Winterfell all the time to visit Lyanna. It's a really nice sentiment, and Ned is really happy that that is the first thing that Robert asked to do. And we see Cersei, we get a little bit of like foreshadowing into Cersei and Jaime's relationship, right? Because this will kind of continue on to page 41, and we'll get there when we get there. But we see that Cersei is kind of protesting about this. And then this makes complete sense because it also goes to establish Robert and Cersei's relationship. Cersei is a woman that is not the most loving person in the world, but this is kind of foreshadowing to how their relationship is broken down to this point where Robert's going to see another woman's grave. It's really, when you look at Cersei's pride and all of that kind of gets thrown in her face, you kind of understand why Cersei is the way she is in this moment. And it's interesting the way we see how this little conflict is concluded, because it is concluded rather quickly. And it's not Roberts that kind of concludes this little thing, which is going to come up a lot when it comes to Jaime and Cersei's relationship. And that will get us into page 41. Now, like I said, page 41 kind of concludes this little Cersei's gripe against Robert doing this. And Jaime kind of comes over, calms her down, and basically gets her to drop the issue. So we see that Jaime and Cersei have a very close relationship, maybe a little too close, as we'll find out a little bit later on, and that Jaime is really having to be the person that is solving the issues, not Robert, for Cersei in that regard. And that's something that's interesting to note in this chapter, because it's subtle foreshadowing to what we'll learn a little bit later on about the two. Now, Robert and Ned head down to the crypts, and we instantly kind of see a little bit of the geography of Westeros, something we really haven't talked about or been informed of yet to this point. And we learn that the North at this point is bigger than all of the other 6 kingdoms combined. It really makes this feel of Europe and then kind of Russia when you look at that, because Europe in its own is smaller than like all of Russia. And that's kind of how I've always like looked at that, is that the North kind of is like Russia in that regard. And it's very interesting the way there has to be like a really strong leadership in the North because of how many different families are here, how vast the North is. It's something that is very much instilled within the Starks, and it's very important to them as well. And Robert's on his journey north, and this is kind of why we were talking about the geography of Westeros, notes that everyone was kind of hiding. And this makes a lot of sense when you think about it from later things that happen in the story, right? So if you think about it, right, later on in the story, everyone is hiding because of the War of the Five Kings. It does not matter which side, everyone's being pillaged. People are losing their crops. They're being robbed, killed. Think about the North from this perspective. If you're just a casual farmer or someone that isn't very powerful, and you see an army of knights, high lords coming through your land, a king, they can do whatever they want to you, right? There's no justice that's going to happen to them. And also, there's this idea that the North just doesn't really like the Southerners. The North they were kings themselves, as we find out later in the chapter. And it makes a lot of sense to me why the Southerners would be a bit more guarded than the rest of the South. Because in the South, it's much more normal for the king to go here or an army to travel through here and that. Because even if you think about Robert's Rebellion, the North wasn't like it was attacked or anything. Like a lot of these northern people have never even seen the king before, and it really paints a lot of context as to what the North is and kind of how it signifies their ideology. And I think there's another idea here is that the winter is so harsh in its climate that even in the summer, they still have snow, right? It's not like it's summer like normally, like, oh yeah, you go to Florida type summer where it's like 90 degrees and all that. The North very much has constant snows throughout. It's just when you get into the actual winter, it's much colder. You have harsher snows. It's an interesting way of describing the North. And another interesting idea here that Ned kind of asks that did the snow bother you on your way up? Could this be foreshadowing to Jon Snow bothering Robert's reign if he is a Targaryen? Because if Jon Snow was said that he is Lyanna and Rhaegar's son, that could be a really big problem for Robert, and I don't think Ned meant it in that regard, but it's an interesting parallel we can kind of come at from George in his writing, because if that was to happen, right, you would think the North would rise up for Jon, because Ned would never allow, like, Robert to kill him. Dorne probably would back him, maybe. There's an interesting idea there, because Rhaegar did cheat on Elia with having Lyanna and all that. So would they back, a Targaryen? Who knows in that situation? Maybe the Tyrells. There's a lot of interesting things that would be interesting to see there. Now, the rest of this page is kind of about how Ned should come south and all the pleasantries of the south. And Robert's basically like, there's all these wine, you can avoid the winters, the women, the food. It shows Robert's appetite and how much he indulges himself and how he's gotten to this point and physical state that he's in at this very moment. So at this point, right, Robert continues going on and basically talks about how the women basically run naked because it's so hot that you can see their breasts and stuff. And Ned is kind of just like, yeah, this is Robert having a big appetite, like I talked about in the last page, and rather different than Ned himself, Ned was never one that really indulged or did things like that, as I feel like you can kind of pick up from the beginning of this chapter and how he's described by other characters like Catelyn and also Bran. Now, by the time they get to the bottom of this stairwell, Robert is visibly breathing heavily and red-faced. Think about this man. This is someone that used to be a warlord. He took down the greatest dynasty in Westeros, the demon of the trident. And now he's barely making it downstairs. It's a really sad picture of Robert. And as we learn more about his background and what drives him as a character, it's tragic to see that he has come to this state of his life. Now, another thing I think is interesting is the way that the crypt is described and the feeling around it. I noted when I was reading that it seems a lot like how the others are described, right? So we come down to the crypts and there's said to be like shadows are lurking and moving, and that the idea that these contained their mortal remains. It's a really weird word choice, and it makes you feel very ominous, especially when we get the idea here that an iron sword is placed at each lord of Winterfell's feet to ward off vengeful spirits. Again, more foreshadowing to a later conflict in the crypts. There seems like there's something going on here, because every single time we're down in the crypts, there's this ominous feeling, and it just feels like there's something that is connected to the others, because they're both painted in the same light when it comes to the feeling, the tone, like we've talked about in the prologue. The others have this feeling of almost like the Nazgul from Lord of the Rings, where there's a feeling of almost dread and a very ominous feeling. Like there's something else going on that we just don't understand. And that's kind of the way the entire crypt scene kind of feels. And that will bring us to page 43. So page 43 is really about exploring what happened with Ned's family, how the Targaryen family came out of power, what kind of crimes they did, because Dany 1 kind of chose us the side from the Targaryen side of things. So how Viserys is like Robert is a usurper and he stole the crown and this or that, and we never really understand why Robert takes the throne. And that is something that we learn more of in this chapter. And I like that we see Viserys' point of view before we see someone like Ned and Robert's point of view and what happened in the war, as they were two of the leading generals in that war. So it's interesting the way there's going to be a contrast and when we get there. We start by describing how the Starks were the kings of the North until the Targaryens. that eventually, because of the Targaryens, they had to bend the knee and they really just became Wardens of the North. That's really kind of the opening part of this little page. And we also have this whole time, right as they've been talking, Robert and Ned are walking towards the crypts. And there's this really great, it's a very quick moment, but there's this idea that Ned knows that his tomb is a little further down. And this foreshadows one thing, that he is going to die by the end of this book. Now, a second thing is, will his remains ever actually reach the crypts? I think it's not very likely based on what's happening in the story as of right now, but it's an interesting question that gets brought up at this point. And as this is being thought about, they finally arrive at Lyanna's tomb. And this is really where we get a bunch of information dropping about what happened during the Targaryen, during Robert's Rebellion, and the lead up to that. We learn that Ned's father and brother were killed very unjustly by the Mad Queen, or the Mad King Aerys. And we also, very much more pivotal in my opinion to the actual story and to Ned's character as a whole, we learn that Ned was not actually supposed to be Catelyn's first husband. It was to be her brother. And this is something that I think that is very important to Ned's character. Because very differently in the books to the show, Ned constantly references that Brandon would know what to do in this situation, that Brandon should have been the Lord of Winterfell, and that he should have married Catelyn, and all these things. Ned never really felt like he was the person that should have been in charge. He felt like someone that should have followed and been a good soldier. And that's just kind of how he feels, right? Ned very much kind of feels like Stannis, where Stannis is a character that follows Robert and never really is put in that position to lead. That's kind of how Ned is until Brandon. That's kind of how Ned still feels even after Brandon's death. And it goes a lot more into understanding Ned and Catelyn's relationship, especially for Catelyn too. I just got done doing my notes on that chapter, and there are a lot of things that have been kind of left unsaid and ripple effects because of Catelyn being Brandon's husband first. Now, another interesting note here is we have this kind of idea that Ned tells us kind of exactly how his father and his brother die, right? He's basically like, Brandon was more or less strangled, and his father was burned. But when he gets to Lyanna, he never tells us how Lyanna dies. It's interesting because it doesn't make any sense when you think about it. Like, you're telling us, the audience, how this and this happened, but then you get to Lyanna and you're like, she just died. Again, very mysterious and something that you would want to keep secret from Robert. Another interesting and major character reveal is that Lyanna was actually supposed to marry Robert. And this is why Robert had so much interest in seeing her and in her as a person, because this was the person he was supposed to marry. And Robert kind of follows this up by saying that she was more beautiful than what her statue looks like. And also, did she really need to be buried in a place like this? Now, one thing I think we should point out here is I think that Robert was more of in love with the idea of Lyanna than actually Lyanna. There's a lot of things that when we get further into the story and we hear more about Robert talking about Lyanna, it doesn't really feel like he ever knew her. It really feels like he knew what he thought was Lyanna. And I think that's an interesting idea that gets played on a lot, that Robert kind of fell for an image, not a person. Line alone really shows us the difference between Robert and Ned, where Ned is much more dutiful and honor bound, where he does his duty, right? If the Starks are supposed to go into the crypts, that's where they're going to go. And even Lyanna wanted to go to the crypts anyway, but it shows that Robert is not really about that, right? If the Baratheons are supposed to be buried here, he'd rather not. He would rather be buried up on a hill somewhere for pleasantries or for other reasons. And to me, it shows a lot of the differences between the two. So we get probably the most interesting part of this chapter right here. Ned states that he was with Lyanna, and that is what she wanted, right? And he also thinks that Lyanna had made him promise something, and only him agreeing to it took her fear away. Now, what would that be? Right? Because if you look at what we're being told is happening here, that Rhaegar kidnapped Lyanna, and Lyanna was raped by Rhaegar, what could Ned possibly have to promise that would take all of her fear away when she's dying? And I think it's just quite obvious that based off of the information here that he would be making him promise to not give Jon to Robert or reveal his true identity. It makes a lot of sense based upon her situation, probably dying in childbirth, and it makes a promise that is something that Lyanna would be at the utmost of her fear at this moment. Her child. A mother's love for her child is stronger than a lot of things. And that is something to me that I think happened in that moment. I think there's other people that speculate maybe this wasn't Jon. Maybe this was some other child. But the way I see it, I think this was probably her giving birth to Jon and her telling Ned to never reveal this information. And also to bring up Jon as well. I think that was a major part of that decision as well. And that will get us into page 44. Page 44 continues with what happens with Lyanna, and we know that Lyanna died shortly after this promise me interaction with Ned, and we learn also that Howland Reed had been the only other person there with him that was alive at this point. We know there were other people, but they die. And what I think is interesting here is that George makes a lot of reference to this. There's a lot of importance placed on this moment here that Ned states that he brings flowers to Lyanna a lot because she liked them. Now, I want to bring attention to something else. If you think about flowers, that is a bastard name in the Reach. Is this another sign that George is pointing to us that Jon, who is apparently a bastard in the North, is not actually a bastard? Could that be? Maybe. Maybe I'm reaching. I don't know. Let me know what you guys think on that. But that is something that George puts a lot of emphasis on. And it is really weird that he would do that. If it was just to say that, oh, Lyanna liked flowers. Or how Ned cared for her a lot. Could be that meaning as well. Now, we learn here that just like how Viserys relives the Battle of the Trident. So we saw that in Dany 1 where Viserys, at times, just in his mind, feels like he's reliving and trying to avenge Rhaegar, beating Robert, the usurper. So does Robert. Robert says that he kills Rhaegar every night, and we see that, like how the picture shows, Robert kills Rhaegar with a crushing blow to his breastplate, and the rubies spread all over the ford. And to me, this is a major insight to the PTSD Robert has of this war, and how that event has just warped his mind. The idea of revenge, of this unquenchable feeling of loss. And he hasn't ever really processed that or really gotten through that. And it's something that majorly drives Robert's alcoholism, probably whoring, and food. And why he treats Cersei so poorly, because Cersei is not the woman that he wants. And that kind of is really present here in this moment. And Ned here in this moment, I just don't think he agrees with Robert, just based upon how quiet he gets. Because if you think about it, right, Robert is talking about killing Targaryens. And if Jon is a Targaryen, it's something Ned's not going to agree on, right? Even though, Robert's talking about Rhaegar here, that anger towards Rhaegar spreads to the Targaryen family as a whole. And Ned really doesn't say anything and then changes the subject. Almost like this is a touchy subject that Ned doesn't want to talk about anymore because he is covering something up, possibly. We don't know for sure, but that's the way I have interpreted it. So Ned then basically changes the subject to Jon Arryn. And Ned asks, what happened with Jon Arryn? What's up with that? And the way that Robert explains it should be a major red flag to not only Ned, but also Robert. Robert explains that his sickness took him quickly. It was almost unnaturally fast. Because we learn in the same page that Jon seemed extremely healthy right before he died. Now again, I know people can look healthy and then die. That is something that happens. But it's a little suspicious. right? So, I mean, I don't know. I mean, you look at in my personal life, my grandfather was very healthy, and he even till when he died, seemed like he was in really good shape. But he then had a heart attack. So maybe it's possible that the characters in the story of this would just be like, oh yeah, he just caught a sickness and died really quick. Maybe that was just the times, but I think that should have been a major red flag for both Ned and Robert at that moment. And that will lead us into page 45, where we're going to talk a little bit more about the political climate of what's going on and also Ned becoming Hand. And this page kind of starts with showing what Jon Arryn was to the two of them. And we got a little bit of this in Catelyn 1, where Catelyn's kind of saying, I know this would be hard for you, and that Jon Arryn was like a father to Ned. But we really get more of that in this. We learn kind of that Jon was really the father figure of both Robert Baratheon and Ned Stark. When you think about this idea that both of their fathers die. So Ned and Robert's fathers both die. Robert's when he was much younger, very tragically, as we'll talk about. We'll get way more into that when we get into Stannis' plotline. And Ned's dying during right before Robert's rebellion, as well as Ned being fostered to Jon Arryn. They had a very close relationship between these three men, and that's made very apparent here at the beginning of page 45. And we also learn what happens to Lysa. We learn that Lysa runs to the Eyrie, and that, interestingly enough, Robert's initial plan was to send the boy to Tywin Lannister to be fostered. Now, let's think about behind the scenes what would have pushed Lysa to... Because we know Lysa poisons her husband. One, it makes it much easier to coerce Lysa into doing this when you think about the idea that Lysa's son was going to be taken away from her. And you think about how much she babies her son, it makes it very interesting that this is the time right before. And I definitely believe it was Littlefinger's big manipulation ploy here. And I don't think we ever really learn who put Tywin up, or whoever put Robert up to doing this. But I think if Littlefinger was involved with that idea, it would have made a lot of sense, because it would have fit perfectly into his plan with manipulating Lysa to kill Jon. And Ned instantly hates this idea, right? And I think we can see why. Ned just does not like the idea of the Lannisters. They came to Robert's side late, as we talked about in Catelyn 1, and how he kind of resents them to a degree. And he tries to reason with Robert that she feared losing her son, which is exactly correct. Right? That is the reason she would retreat. There's other reasons, of course, but the reason that Jon dies is mainly outside of the Littlefinger, like her and Littlefinger having a relationship and all that. She feared losing her son. And to me, it's amazing how blind Robert is at this moment, because one, the Lannisters already have a ton of power. As we've already seen, they're flexing their power already. Robert just gives them more. And we find out later on that Robert's in huge debt to the Lannisters. It's something where Robert really doesn't know how to manage it. And it's very similar to Viserys with the Hightowers, or even the Velaryons, if you want to go that far in House of the Dragon. Very similar to what's going on there. Now, Ned offers the solution that he would foster Robert Arryn instead of Lysa if needed. And Lysa if needed. And Robert at this moment says no, this would hurt Lannister pride, because Tywin had already accepted. And this really, to me, shows, it's our first indication of how feared Tywin is. Where if this was other lords, right, I don't think Robert would have much of a problem. But when you look at the idea that Tywin has projected his power, he has a lot of influence, and he's rich, outside looking in. And also that Robert is surrounded by Lannisters. Jaime, his wife, is a Lannister. He has Lannister children. It's an interesting idea when you look at the awful position Robert has backed himself into. And Ned kind of states, who cares about his pride? And I think this is weird, because I think Ned doesn't fully understand the situation. And that's not all Ned's fault. Ned's not been given the information of how Tywin Lannister has made himself irreplaceable. Kind of like Littlefinger, but even more so. And pissing the Lannisters off at this point really is not a great idea. And it's just something Ned doesn't really know. but we kind of understand why Ned's saying it. And the page ends with Robert telling Ned to take a walk with him, and they are going to kind of talk about the Warden of the East situation and also who is to become Hand of the King. Page 46 begins with this feeling of, again, an eeriness, that Ned and Robert are being watched, almost as if they're being warning signs telling him to not do this. And we even see that at the very end of the chapter, but it's interesting the way that we have this ominous feeling surrounding the crypts. And Robert kind of asks Ned, why do you think that he came this far? And Ned really already knows. He's just kind of playing dumb. And he mentions that Robert should see the wall. And what's interesting here is kind of how the whole series goes when it treats the wall, outside of really the North, and even the North scoffs at it at times. Robert basically like plays this off and is like, yeah, okay, maybe later, Ned, you goof. Like, he really plays it off, doesn't really take any seriousness in the status of the wall. And Ned even notes that the Night's Watch is failing, which is completely true. They have fallen in their man count. They don't have as much manpower, and they're really not getting any recruits to fill that up. And this page mainly talks on the issue of the Warden of the East, which Robert thinks should not be Robert Aaron. Because he's 6, he's not a war leader, and to me, this doesn't make any sense from Robert's point of view. And this goes to Robert's character, where Robert is someone that thrives in war and conflict. He doesn't understand that they're at peace right now. It doesn't matter, right, who he does war, unless he's expecting a war, right? And we know at this point he has gotten no information yet that Dany is being wed to Khal Drogo, so he doesn't know that information at this point. He shouldn't be expecting a war. There should be no war coming. Like, there should be no conflict with the Lannisters, just based on the fact that he believes that his children are part Lannister. It does not benefit Tywin Lannister going into open rebellion or something like that. So it's this interesting idea that why does Robert think that Robert Aaron needs to be a war leader to be Warden of the East? And Ned kind of counters that as well. Ned's like, we are at peace. It doesn't really make any sense. And the other issue here is that the Warden of the East, we find out, possibly Robert was going to name Jaime Lannister Warden of the East, which in my opinion makes even less sense because you already have Tywin, who is the Warden of the West. This makes no sense politically to make him the Warden of the East. And the obvious solution here is to just name, if you're going to name anyone else besides Robert Aaron Warden of the East, name Stannis Warden of the East. Simple. You have Stannis at Dragonstone. He's on the eastern side. He's one of your staunchest supporters, even if you don't have a great relationship. He's a great military commander, which is what you said you were looking for in a war leader. Doesn't really make any sense, and it's really because Robert's relationship with his brothers is terrible, especially Stannis. It really does kind of open that up when you do a reread of why is this such a tough topic. It should be either you're doing Robert Aaron, which is what he should be doing, or he does Stannis. There shouldn't be any other debate here. So, I don't know. That's my personal thoughts, but yeah. Moving on to page 47. And this is where we finally get the big reveal that Robert needs Ned down south, and how Robert is struggling to rule and kind of the pains of it. He hates ruling, counting coppers, holding up laws. Everyone is either a flatterer or a liar. And it's really very much the exact same speeches we hear Viserys use in House of the Dragon. It's really the same idea. And when we look at Robert Baratheon and Viserys Targaryen, they're very similar kings in how they rule and how they try to do things. I think Viserys, in the House of the Dragon version of his character anyway, tries to do a bit more than Robert, but that's really what we see here, is that Robert's really pleading for Ned to rule the kingdoms for him. Ned at this moment kind of understands now what Robert is going through, why Robert has become this person that he is now, and I think Ned feels bad for his friend and wants to help his friend at this moment. And Robert finally pops the big question: Ned, will you be my Hand of the King? Now, Ned is not surprised by this. Again, I think he saw this coming as soon as he knew that Robert was coming north. But it is interesting now that it's officially been pointed out, because this is our big point of the early part of the book. This is the moment. Is Ned going to accept becoming Hand? We also learn here that the Hand is the second most powerful person, and that you can enforce a lot of laws using the king's name. Very powerful position. Even more powerful than, say, like the vice president in America, where it kind of feels like an empty title at times. The Hand of the King is definitely not an empty title, and it does grant you a ton of power. Just look at the way Otto Hightower uses it in House of the Dragon, or even Tyrion in A Song of Ice and Fire as well. Now, more importantly in this page, we learn that this is not really what Ned wants at all. I think a lot of people would have seen this coming, but Ned is not someone that is motivated by gaining power in these things. Ned doesn't even want to be the Lord of Winterfell. And I think that's very similar to Jon. Jon doesn't want to be really the Lord Commander. He's pushed into this position because he has to, and it's because it's his duty and his honor and all of that. And Ned, in this moment, we really see how he's trying to get out of it. Like, he's kind of trying to make up excuses or buy himself time to think about it. And we really see the dynamic between the Hand and the king, where there's this idea that the common folk use, where the king eats and the Hand takes the shit. And that is really what happens. There's another line where the king thinks up ideas and then the Hand builds them. Very similar things, and that's really what Robert is asking. Robert is asking Ned to basically rule the kingdoms for him so that he can, continue indulging himself. And that leads us into page 48. And our last page is really about what Ned is going to do, and it seems like Ned at this point now is he's being more watched than ever. The eyes around him seem to be disapproving and warning Ned against this, and maybe there's this idea that maybe the old gods are warning Ned not to go south, that maybe this or that is warning him to not go south, and we know it's not going to work, but it is a warning, and it is more foreshadowing to Ned's inevitable fate of going down south. Now, we also learn here that Robert is going to bind up their houses, just like he and Lyanna were going to. He is going to have Joffrey and Sansa be wed to unite their houses. Now, this wouldn't happen for a while because they're both still very young, but that would unite them, like how the Lannisters and the Baratheons have been united. It's a very big power play. This is a huge thing because the Starks now would then have their line on the throne. That's something that they have not had before. So this is a very interesting idea, and it's a big power grab here. Ned would become Hand of the King, would have the heir to the Iron Throne now married to his daughter. This is a huge deal. Like, and we understand, like, later on when we get into Cat 2, why Cat 2 wants Ned to take this role because of things like that. But it is a lot of things that really don't affect Ned. Ned doesn't want power. If you went to any other lord and said this, something like this, they would take it in a heartbeat. And this chapter really ends on a very sour note. Like, this should be, like I talked about, a huge promotion. You're gaining a ton. But Ned is kind of filled with dread. And he notes that this is where he belongs, not down south. And because he goes against those principles, again, more foreshadowing to his death in this book. And this page in the chapter concludes with him telling Robert, "Can I have some time to discuss this with Catelyn?" And Robert more or less says, "Yeah, of course, but don't take too much time." And that is how Ned 1 ends. I personally think this is the first 10 out of 10 chapter of the series. I'm doing a kind of an idea for a later video, much later, probably the end of the year, at this year, where I have this rating system, and I'm going to be ranking every single chapter in a Game of Thrones, and so far, this was my personal favorite. I love what we get about the Targaryens, the foreshadowing of Ned's outcome, of Jon's parentage, what happened at Tower of Joy, inner look at Ned and even Robert in this chapter. Just a ton of world building. The significance of this chapter is huge. To me, this is, I think, the best chapter so far that we've done. I hope you guys all enjoyed it. I'm glad we're back recording and we're getting back into this. Next week, I believe we have Jon 1, if I'm not mistaken. I think we have Jon 1 and then Catelyn 2. I'm looking forward to doing those ones as well. Both of them are very strong chapters as well. So So thank you guys all for watching this video, and I hope to see you guys Thursday. We will be doing a video about House of the Dragon. We'll be talking about the Velaryon family, and do they pose issues with how they were cast and also the direction of their characters. Why have they been such a weak part of the show, where in reality they should have been a stronger part of the show? But let me know what you guys think, and I'll see you guys all in the next video. Bye, guys.
If you think this has a happy ending, you haven't been paying attention.